That means that we will have a presentation. All right, let's see how this works. Oh, started at the end. That's not necessarily what we want. Hold on, I'll just go back to the front here. Okay, Chris, does that look good to you?
That looks good.
Okay. So thanks again, everyone. I'd like to talk to you about a little bit of general and a little bit of specific science. So one of the roles that I've taken on as scientific director of the Ocean Frontier Institute is really a communication role between ocean observers and ocean scientists and some of the international bodies that help us decide how we're going to save ourselves from climate change. So I've titled my talk, Protecting Our Climate Through Ocean Observation. And I'm hoping that these slides will move. Yes, and they do. Just as a reminder, I think we're all aware that climate change has massive impacts on us. It challenges the integrity of communities. And here in Halifax, we just had a recent Hurricane Fiona, hit us. And hurricane preparedness was something that we've improved on, but we're not used to hurricanes in Canada. The ocean is cold here, so hurricanes always used to kind of peter out before they hit us, and now suddenly we're actually facing massive storms that, because of a warming ocean, are getting closer and closer to us, and in fact hitting us. We've had the last 3 years, we've had 2 1 in 100 year storms. So clearly things are changing pretty rapidly. And that means we have to worry a bit about our coastal infrastructure. I was just at COP27 in Egypt, and the mayor of my town actually came with us to Egypt and talked about the importance of understanding hurricanes and other climate threats, because municipalities need to know. I also met the mayor of Miami at COP26. She was a super interesting lady and also very aware of these challenges. And perhaps the most interesting conversation I had was with the governor of Alexandria, which is a coastal city in Egypt. And he was terrified because of sea level rise and a new thing called medicanes, which are sort of storms that are big enough to actually, not really as big as hurricanes, but the Mediterranean has never had anything like this before. And so these medicanes are now threatening the coast of the Mediterranean, including the city of Alexandria, which of course has huge historic importance. So not just coastal infrastructure, and particularly here in Canada, we have food security issues because so many of our communities depend on fishing, particularly Indigenous communities who've seen some of their big fish stocks go from 300,000, for example, spawning salmon going from 300,000 per year to 300 per year. And along with that loss of the actual resource of the salmon comes this kind of existential anxiety and grief at the loss of those wild fish stocks. And of course, we have drought, again, driven by the ocean, heat waves, primarily driven by the ocean, and hurricanes, as I mentioned, driven by ocean surface heat. And many of these coming together in some nations can actually be so disruptive that they actually trigger war. So I think it's very important for all of us to remember that climate change has impacts across the board, and that whatever we do has to take that into consideration. The other thing that many policymakers, I bet most people in this room and online here are aware of this, but many policymakers nationally and internationally simply are not, that the ocean actually controls our climate and holds 10 times the heat of the atmosphere. In fact, 90% of the heat that's been produced during climate change was stored in the ocean. And it also holds 50 times the carbon of the atmosphere. And this is, again, something that we're not often aware of. And when you say this, policymakers look gobsmacked, like they have absolutely no idea how important the ocean is and how it continues to essentially buffer us from the worst effects of climate change. So when we talk about a 1.5 degree goal, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put forward this notion of the 1.5 degree warming as the goal that we should be aiming for. And we really need to link ocean observation to these climate targets, because most of us we're land mammals. So most of what we do is land-based. So we have land-based emissions targets, and those often don't recognize at all the ocean's role in carbon and heat absorption. And so what happens is we set our targets on land, but if the if the ocean kind of rolls over in its sleep, or some of its functions change, and it starts to outgas some of the carbon that it's absorbed over the last few hundred years, that could actually completely swamp anything we're doing on land. And so the ocean remains this critical piece that we're sort of the silent partner that we don't know enough about. And in addition to that, climate modelers are signaling that they are seeing some increased uncertainty around extreme events. So let's take the hurricanes, for example. As they become larger and potentially longer lived, we need to predict them more clearly. And for the Canadian East Coast, for example, the trajectory of the storms is pretty well. It's the prediction's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And certainly a couple days before the storm hits, they know pretty much where it's going to hit. But the intensity is not well predicted, and that's huge, because whether or not you have a Category 3 or a Category 5 storm absolutely means completely different types of preparation. And we did see some misfires, I believe, in the United States, where there were mass evacuations for hurricanes that didn't actually arrive in the same way that they thought. And then if you don't prepare, then of course you put human lives and infrastructure at risk. So getting this right is an existential problem that we simply need to solve. So there's been a lot of discussion about what they call mitigation. So that is carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And this discussion is revving up internationally. I think there's a really interesting organization based in the US, but not only American, called Ocean Visions, which brings together ocean observers and some practitioners who are testing out methods to take up carbon dioxide and sequester it. Now, the difference between sequestration and absorption, I think, is an important one. So sequestration means tucked away out of harm's way for a reasonable length of time. And what that length of time is hasn't really been standardized, but you'd assume it has to be longer than at least 100 years, because that's what we're trying to save ourselves from, is climate change over the next 100 years. So sequestration means out of sight, and not out of mind, but definitely tucked away. And one of the places that has been a big focus is the blue carbon ecosystems on our coast. I know you have many of those where you are. We certainly have them on the Canadian coast, and they're everywhere globally, but with different key species. So we have mangroves, particularly in tropical areas, tidal marshes, seagrasses, and also kelp in some areas. That's maybe a little more controversial, but the idea is that the carbon that these organisms have taken up is stored in the sediments, primarily as root systems. And so you have massive root systems that can go meters down below where those plants are, that have stored carbon for a long period of time. And essentially that carbon, all those little seas that you see underneath the seagrasses and tidal marshes, those are actually another fossil carbon store. So if you disrupt those blue carbon ecosystems, you actually could release that important store of carbon, and it is another store that you simply has to stay locked down. The problem here, though, is that people are selling this as a climate mitigation system. And I think that's a really different conversation that we need to have. We want to keep these ecosystems well structured. They bring biodiversity, they protect the coastline, they're important for livelihoods, infrastructure, and fish stocks. It's super important to keep these systems intact and undisrupted. But they're being sold for something they're not. And that's the solution to climate change. So this purple arrow you see here is the carbon dioxide going into these mangroves and seagrasses and salt marshes. And that is an important arrow, but as you'll see from the next slide, it's actually very, very tiny in comparison. So on an annual basis, it's very, very tiny in comparison to the perturbations we actually need to save ourselves from climate change. So the systems are important. It's very critical to keep those conserved, but on an annual basis, they're not going to save us from ourselves. Let me just go to the next slide. Okay, so in total, these systems globally will take up about 0.8 gigatons per year. That is 3% of our carbon dioxide emissions, and that's not going to do it. So if we look at these systems globally, you can see their annual carbon sequestration potential in millions of tons of carbon or gigatons of carbon. And you can see that all over the world, you have these systems. The problem is that these numbers are actually too small to make a global impact. So while their carbon stores in the sediment are super important to preserve, they themselves are not going to get us where we're going. So one of the things we need to do is to track ocean carbon far better than we already do. We know that more than 90% of ocean carbon is actually on the high seas, in the deep sea, and that is dissolved carbon as carbonate in the deep ocean, plankton, marine snow, and carbon that's stored in marine sediments. But most carbon observation is actually done on land and in the atmosphere. And this is what most politicians and other policymakers understand as the carbon sink. We do a lot of work on land and an atmosphere to track carbon. There's a lot of discussion about soil carbon, which is important, and tree planting and forests, which of course store carbon long-term as long as they're left undisrupted. Ocean carbon observations, on the other hand, are actually very, very small in comparison to what we actually observe on land. However, the actual carbon stores are in the ocean. So we observe carbon stored in soils in the atmosphere and on land, but what we really need to get a handle on is the carbon stored in the oceans. The ocean stores 80% of the Earth's total carbon. And even more important than that, we care about blue carbon for many reasons, the coastal blue carbon, but over 90% of all the carbon that's stored in the ocean is actually deep blue carbon. And deep blue carbon is stored on the high seas in the deep ocean. And that we don't observe very well, as it turns out. So just another way of looking at this, carbon reservoirs by size, I believe that the total value of this circle is roughly 42,000 gigatons. And the oceans hold it. Ocean sediments hold some, permafrost, and soil, atmosphere, and vegetation are relatively small. So the oceans are really the big carbon reservoir. I know I'm beating this to death as a kind of theme, but what I'm finding over and over again is people just don't understand this, and that what it means is that their attention is not where it needs to be. So where does our attention need to be? It needs to be in what I'm calling deep blue carbon. And so if we look at these major pools, the major pools, in other words, like where the buckets are, where all the carbon is sitting in the ocean. The surface ocean holds about 900 gigatons, the deep ocean 37,000 gigatons, the ocean sediments about 150 gigatons. And if we look at the major, and that's in contrast to the, the 0.8 or the 0.3 that we're talking about in the blue carbon ecosystems. The major fluxes are the deep sea carbon sinks are 90 gigatons per year. The dissolved organic carbon in the world ocean, dissolved, in other words, dissolved organic carbon, mostly carbon that originates from life but is released into the ocean, is 20% of global export. So if we actually want to zoom in on important carbon stocks, it's things like the DOC, or dissolved organic carbon, that we actually need to think about. As that's 20%. So we can actually take up between 25 and 30% of carbon dioxide emissions through these particular fluxes in the open ocean. So let's zoom in. So now I want to talk a little bit about the research side of what we do. And one of the things that's really struck me is that we need to be observing the carbon sinks, fluxes, and pools in the open ocean much better than we have been. And I like instruments that are off the shelf and measure things quickly and give the data sets that can be analyzed in virtually in real time. And one of them that I've been working with recently is the Underwater Vision Profiler, which is an imaging sensor. It gives you the little scale bars on the right, and on the right is a big picture, a collage of images that this sensor took in the Arctic. So it was the first collage of Arctic images from the UVP, or Underwater Vision Profiler. And that little line there is a 2mm scale bar, just to give you a sense. So these are the big animals. These aren't the typical animals. They're the collection of big animals. So they're a little bit dramatic. But what this does is take pictures of also, so on the right there, you can see this kind of big, a cluster, sort of a marine snow cluster. It looks a bit like a mixed fecal pellet mix of carbon. And it's those that hold most of the carbon in many parts of the deep sea. And so what this instrument does is image that really, really well. And so you can take particle size distributions and actually turn it with a bit of careful calibration into measurements of ocean, biologically generated ocean carbon. Oh, now is this going to let me? Oh, good. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on one case study just because we got a nice paper out this week and I wanted to share it with you. And it's because we had when I was working at the Alfred Wegener Institute, particularly, it's a polar research institute, and we're focusing in on the Arctic carbon budget, which is really not very well constrained. The Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than the global average. And we know that in the Arctic, both particulate organic carbon, or POC, and dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, transport, depending on where that transport happens, it can really change, potentially increase, carbon dioxide retention times in the Arctic. And we also know that the Arctic is changing quickly because of sea ice melt. And so the formation of dense water plumes and mixing in the Arctic is changing rapidly as that slick of fresh water is kind of going out over the Arctic and the North Atlantic. We also know in the Arctic that lateral transport is a major uncertainty. So lateral transport globally is a major uncertainty in vertical decay models. I don't know if you remember something called the Martin curve, which is this decay curve. It shows you, you get carbon produced by photosynthesis at the surface, and then there's an exponential decay as it goes into the deep sea. But that's been parameterized hundreds of times. But what Martin said in that original paper, and people forget to remember, is that if lateral transport happens, it completely perturbs the Martin curve, and we're not always good at picking that up. We sometimes think that a lateral transport plume is a change in the exponential decay coefficient because we're thinking one dimensions. We think just in the vertical as oceanographers. And I remember I was always trained, you make a little measurement in a teacup and you multiply by 1 billion and you call it the ocean, right? So we're not that great at scaling up in a careful way at scales of the shelf scale and lateral currents. So the Barents Sea is a really interesting place. It's biologically very productive. It has dense water formation that happens right off the shelf and sinks into the deep Arctic. And it's a hot spot for carbon dioxide uptake, and also in some cases we've also measured nitrogen fixation there. So it's kind of interesting. So the questions we were asking were around how does the oceanography of the Arctic and the lateral transport in particular impact the Arctic carbon budget? And this paper, the first author is Andreas Rugge, who was my PhD student who was on this cruise, and a selection of German and Russian colleagues. This is a view. So on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the Norwegian Sea, Greenland Sea, and the Barents Sea. Just trying to move this little window so I can see my actual. Oh, it's not going to do it. Wow. Oh, it did. Okay, good. So now I can see my picture better. So the Barents Sea is right there in the middle between Svalbard and Novaya Zemlya in Russia. This was a very interesting research cruise. There was a number of technicians who were putting moorings together, even though they were told they weren't allowed to put moorings together before they crossed the shelf, and they were taken back to shore and sent home immediately. So there were a number of people prowling around the ships in, oh, no, I don't want that to do that. Okay. There was a lot of security, I'll put it that way. And it was sort of presaging the route that the German-Russian collaboration had gone on for a few decades, and it was very strong. The Germans supported a major research lab in St. Petersburg for about 40 years. And that sadly, the tension on this research voyage has really showed that is no longer a possible geopolitically. That means that this data set is even more precious than it would have been, because it's unlikely that something like this will be able to be done for the foreseeable future. So Andreas was on board, and he used the underwater vision profiler to do a set of measurements. And you can see here's just a view. There's a 50-kilometer scale bar there, and you can see some of the intense biological productivity in the Barents Sea. And the question was, well, where does that end up as a carbon source and sink? And I guess, you might think the Barents Sea is not that deep, so perhaps it just sinks and then is remineralized and brought back up to the surface. However, So here's the map on the left-hand side of where they went. And what you can see is so that's A there. I'm not sure how well you can see all this. Anyway, and if you look at B is going from, see the little red square up there going from the Severnaya Zemlya down to the Nansen Basin. So that's right off the shelf. So it's going from the Barents Sea shelf down into the Nansen Basin of the Arctic Ocean towards the north. And if you look at that slice down in figure B here, you can see this is the underwater vision profiler profiles. And what you can see is that dark blue is this high particle volume. So lots of particulate organic carbon sitting there right on the shelf break in a very specific bottom, forming water mass called the Barents Sea bottom water. So this is concentrated in water that looks like it's cooling and settling into the Nansen Basin. And on the right, you can see a TS plot for those of you who like those. I love TS plots. And one of the sad things about being a director of an institute is I don't get to look at them anymore. So that's probably why this one appears in my talk. And so what that shows you is the different water masses along that transect. And you can see that, and then the concentration of high particle volume is really in that Barents Sea bottom water that's at a high salinity and a low temperature, and it's going to be sinking down into the Arctic Basin. Come on. And so on the left here, you can see that the turbidity and fluorescence actually follow different patterns than the particles actually sink with respect to. So if you look, I'll just go back if I can. Yeah, so you can see how the particles are down below and the turbidity and fluorescence are above. So turbidity and fluorescence are really a measure of plankton, and the particles are sinking down below that layer of highly productive water. And so on the right here, what you can see is velocity in meters per second and relative number of particles. So this is from a model that we used. It's the finite element sea ice ocean model, which confirmed this lateral injection that we thought was happening from the shelf. So we went to the modelers and wanted to, when we saw this high load of small particles in suspension, we saw that it had the potential for long range transport, and several lines of field evidence support that essentially when we get into these deep sea areas, we can see non-local source of particles. So that was the benthic indicator species from the Barents Sea are present in that water mass, which we wouldn't expect if they were locally sourced, for example. And finally, this is a sort of a little cartoon here. You're looking now from the Arctic side, from the north. Oh, I'm not clicking very well. Sorry about that. You're going from the north, you're looking across the Nansen Basin to the Barents Sea shelf. So you're looking south essentially, and you can see these little slices are particle volume measured by the underwater vision profiler. And you can see how that plume, which is in that little gray cloud there, is sort of carrying the particles along the shelf and down into the basin. So we also, working with the modelers, I just put this up for those of you who care. We track this back, and you can see that the current has been around for 20, 30 years. And you can see that both particulate organic carbon and dissolved organic carbon would be important components of that plume. And you can also see that the net volume transport since the 1980s has sort of gone up and down, but it's consistent around 2 spheredrops, but of course has a seasonal cycle imposed upon it. So this just kind of nested it in the historic data and in the understanding of the oceanography for that region. So what does this sort of study, let's zoom back out again, and let's ask the question, what does this sort of study mean for our understanding of climate change and how we're going to move forward in the future? And I think that what we see is instruments like the underwater vision profiler and others are really changing the type of work we need to do in oceanography. So this is a really nice paper, came out in Nature earlier this year by, I think her name was Anya Annie Bratt, I think her name was, who was the first author in this paper. Anyway, what she showed was that there's been a huge change in the flavor of ocean information that's coming from the ocean. And what you can see on this plot is from 1925 to 2015. You can see the sort of the orange and brown bars there are showing you traditional oceanography. So since probes and bottles, CTD casts. And you can see that since the mid 80s to early 90s, those have actually been declining globally. And that's something that the Global Ocean Observing System is super concerned about, because those data are usually in the public repositories. So they're funded by governments, and they tend to end up in databases that are searchable, and they have open data policies. And so those are observation data that anyone can use and that can be synthesized. If you look at the blue data, you can see that those are probes, they're surface drones, they're buoys, they're gliders, and more data have been collected in this manner since 2000 than over the previous 100 years. And so what we're seeing is a complete sea change, if you will, or a change in the flavor of ocean data that's being provided to us. The other concern and challenge we have there, so if you can see that, I mean, marine animals can get under ice, so that's a great thing. Autonomous vehicles is the bulk of it. And we also have moored to drifting buoys, and some of those, of course, are Argo floats, and those are in public repositories. But that light blue, the autonomous vehicles, those are largely from the private sector. So those come generally from for-profit organizations, and there's two challenges with that data. So some of the people look at this graph and they say, oh, well, it's great. Now the private sector has taken over. We now have the data we need because others are providing it. But there's two things. They're not the equivalent data. A CTD probe down to 4,000 meters, which is beautifully QA/QC'd, is simply not the same as a bunch of sensors strapped onto a sail drone. In some cases, those drones and drifting buoys do have good QA/QC, but it's much more variable in private sector data than it is in the type of data that traditional oceanographers like myself might be used to. So it's the QA/QC is a problem. The other thing is much of the data is in lockdown and not visible to us. So we don't actually know often what's there. So it's hard to decide exactly what you might be interested in. So one of the things that this has caused is kind of challenges in mapping the flows of ocean data. So when I first raised with the Canadians that I felt that we needed to understand the North Atlantic carbon flows, for example, carbon fluxes, partly because the North Atlantic absorbs 30% of the carbon that oceans absorb. I just asked, so we were collaborating with the National Research Council in Canada to do some mapping of where does ocean data originate and where does it go to. And what we found was a lot of the best data comes from Met offices. There's government programs, there's satellite data, and there's your classic CTD and mooring data. We then mapped that through the 10 most referenced data sets in the scientific literature, and then mapped it through what they call reanalysis products, which are so there's ocean reanalysis that happens to these data, and then they go on through ocean models, biogeochemistry models and ocean circulation models, and eventually they end up in these, what we call, the big scale ocean reanalysis. So what the outcome of this is just a very first order analysis, but we worked with the 10 most referenced data sets in the literature and the 12 most used models. And what we notice is that there's an urgent need for better, good data products. We need a lot more incorporation of actual ocean carbon measurements into these reanalysis. Almost all the reanalysis are temperature and salinity, and then they go into process models. They don't actually take the carbon data themselves, reanalyze them, and put them into the analysis. We also need a much more standardized approach to ocean carbon monitoring. And so we're kind of continuing on with this work and engaging with the international community to say, okay, where can we start to consider putting better ocean carbon measurements. For example, I was talking to the head of the OSNAP array. I'm trying to remember. She used to be head of AGU, Louise. Okay, that's my senior moment. Anyway, basically what she was saying was, yeah, we have no carbon sensors on the OSNAP array, even though it's right in the critical piece in the North Atlantic. And so let's do that. Let's find a way to fund getting some carbon sensors on that. Now, that's okay, but unless there's and that's a great idea. In fact, I was completely enthusiastic about that. But unless there's a pathway for those data actually to be included in some of these products, they're only useful to researchers. Now, of course, we're important, right? But we're not as important as the global climate. So if we can't get the carbon data and the carbon reanalyses into the global models, then, we've kind of not done our job. So that's kind of where my head is right now, trying to have this conversation. And in the meantime, we have students and researchers trying to cope with this nonstop flood of data, which has really changed. We no longer have data sets, we have data streams. So data now flow like a river, and you can name a river, you can change its course, you can observe it, but as it floods, you cannot hold on to it. And so that means that individual data sets, those little data sets that we used to save on our desktop or our laptop, those are almost irrelevant now, because the flow of data are so large. The flows of data are so large that unless we start to work on naming and managing these flows, what we're doing is irrelevant. And this is actually an interesting conversation that we're having with the private sector, because the private sector loves to hold on to its data sets, particularly, for example, oil and gas. We've had lots of discussions with them. They love to lock down their data for all sorts of proprietary and important economic reasons. But sometimes they may end up completely irrelevant, because the data flows are kind of washing by them now, and they're holding on to their little test tube of data, and the river is flowing by, right? So it's a change in scale. It's a change in thinking of how we need to do things. So in some cases, the where the data is and where the users are, there's a huge gap there, and we urgently need to work across this gap. Organizations like the Global Ocean Observing System try to do this. They kind of stretch themselves across to get between providers and users. They're generally unfunded volunteer organizations that are not heavily supported by nations and are run on a, small of an oily rag by IOC, UNESCO. So it's getting across this gap that's crucial for oceanography right now, so that we can save ourselves from climate change. And so it's a gap that we need to fill. It's a gap that was discussed quite a lot at COP27, and just a quick mention of that. It was a very interesting conversation. Sadly, the first two pictures that are very beautiful, we didn't really get to see much of that because we were spending most of the time on the third picture there, having discussions on how to really move the world towards saving itself from climate change. So what I did at COP was to moderate an event called Earth Information Day, and it's when the ocean observers and atmospheric observers and earth scientists, they present to the parties. So the Council of Parties, right, that's COP, and parties are nations. And so nations send representatives into these meetings, and there's about 300, 400 people in the room. And you're basically telling them what the state of the Earth atmosphere, in terms of land, ocean, and atmosphere, what's the state of that, to get them into the mood for the substantive negotiations which come after that. And those negotiations are super hard. In fact, I've heard a lot of criticism. I always hear lots of criticisms of the COPs, and I've only been to 2 myself. But this year was the first year I was closely involved with the negotiations. And I just have to say, the people who do that work are unbelievable humans. They do incredibly difficult work with no glamour whatsoever in the back rooms, edging tough negotiators towards not consensus, towards agreement. And so when you hear about an agreement at COP, it is unanimous between the 197 nations, right? So a unanimous agreement, that is an amazing achievement. And that's why it's so hard and that there are so few. So this year, one of the discussions was to endorse the Global Climate Observation System Implementation Plan, which includes a lot of oceanography, which actually pushes for more Argo floats and more CTD casts, in a context where CTD casts may be actually almost irrelevant in terms of the size of the data set they're actually producing right now in comparison to the rest of the ocean data. But at the very least, oceans were on the table, and negotiators heard about them. They saw my little pictures with the dots, big dots and little dots, which I presented at Earth Information Day, and they went into the back room and they actually did come strongly towards. They endorsed the Global Climate Observation System Implementation Plan, and they also came very many steps towards agreeing on a global goal for observation. And again, saying that this agreement is astonishing, really, in my view, because these are nations with lots to fight about, and yet they come to unanimous agreement on some of these matters. So that's a skilled negotiation that's beyond what I can get my head around in some cases. And one example, for example, so when we were talking about the global goal for observation, one nation spoke up and said, why should my nation agree with this when essentially climate change is being caused by Western nations burning too much fossil fuels? We didn't cause climate change, you did. And now you're going to observe my carbon emissions in my developing nation when I'm just trying to get my feet under me and function in an economic world? Like, how is that fair? So really interesting conversations around what is relevant here. And that means that those nations that feel that way, that they don't want to be scrutinized by the other nations that caused climate change in the first place and are now pointing the finger elsewhere, you have to come to terms. And they do, and I think that's remarkable. That's enough on that. But I really am very impressed with what these negotiators do, I have to say. And I also managed to get into one of the local mosques on the two right pictures there to have a look, and they're very beautiful there at Sharm el-Sheikh. And I had to wear a new style of outfit to do that. So to bring this all kind of to a conclusion here, we really do need to establish an agreement on how to observe the changing atmosphere, land, and ocean to reach our climate targets. And the ocean is the least observed in comparison to its importance. There's a lot of observation in the atmosphere, and there's quite a bit of observation on land. Observation in the ocean is under threat in the sense that, particularly under COVID and under investment, many of the data streams in the ocean, I think we've analyzed that only about 20% or less than 20% of them are actually sustainable or sustained. And that means that between 75 and 80% of ocean observation is potentially on the decline. That is terrifying if we're trying to get to our climate targets. And so we have to act quickly to bring nations to the table to discuss ocean observation. As I mentioned, small differences in perspectives, or not so small in some cases, can hinder attempts to achieve consensus. But the IPCC and other intergovernmental institutions are really providing a strong framework for these global assessments. So one of the things that we're pushing forward, I thought I was finishing. I forgot. I'm going to tell you one more thing. Okay, hopefully I'm not going on too long. So one of the ways that I've been trying to get the attention of policymakers is to push for something called the North Atlantic Climate Observatory, or the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory. And the idea is to bring nations together internationally to talk about how to coordinate and collaborate on ocean observation, and to start with the North Atlantic as a pilot, because you have to start somewhere, and it's already pretty well observed by rich nations. So the idea is that you take all these observations, you pull them into a data factory where you make products that matter to people, you cross that great divide that we talked about, and form a synthesis center where you can interact with scientists who can bring value to those, and create products that synthesize real-time data for the people who need it. And that means the public need to be aware, industry that are investing, and policymakers for climate strategy. And we know that industry engagement and growth is very, very important. What we've seen here in Canada is a huge explosion of interest in carbon dioxide removal technologies, including ocean alkalinity enhancement, the sinking of kelp into the deep sea. Most of these, there's discussion. So again, we have a little bit of a challenge with scale. So most of these have been proven in a teacup, then they've gone into a tank, and now they're talking about maybe going into a basin. And then from there to the coastal, the continental shelf, and potentially, if you're going to get to those gigatons, you very likely will have to go to the open ocean. And we're lucky that scientists have been working for the last 8 years or so to improve the London Protocol, which would kind of puts a brake on putting things in the ocean, to allow ocean alkalinity enhancement and other carbon dioxide removal technologies to be tested and validated. The other thing that is really important here are the financial and data services. And at COP27, there was a lot of discussion about climate finance. We were part of some of those discussions. And getting new models and new tools, new financial tools to invest in, for example, developing nation carbon sinks and making sure that those are robust. Very, very important. And then we've been talking a lot to carbon dioxide removal investors and customers, and that's a revving engine. That's something that's really becoming more and more intense. And they need the best possible framework for a burgeoning industry, and that means the best possible ocean observation supported by real science and good scientists with engagement. And what I'm continuously saying to the finance sector is, if you want this to happen quickly, you need to support research. Mostly because we need the best researchers and observation to support this scale up. Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves in trouble and cause more, it'll cause more problems than it solves. So we're in the middle of those conversations as well. And I'm sure many of you are also. So in the end, what are we trying to achieve? Well, we can think back to the early 60s and nations united to build the International Space Station. And they came together to talk about, well, we have infrastructure and money to invest, and we have scientific expertise. So if we come together and we build something together as nations, we can then share the data and disseminate that back as public good. And the public good, okay, there was a lot of criticism of the space station eventually because it was a rich nation enterprise. But it's that spirit of collaboration that I think we need for ocean observation, and I think we can start with the North Atlantic. And so we really need to inspire the same effort and the same synthesis for ocean observation as we did back in the day for the International Space Station. And there's other models here. For example, there's models of the international telescopes do this, right? So they bring nations together. They all they observe, and sometimes in some cases distributed. So the International Black Hole Telescope is distributed telescopes all over the world, and then they come together for individual events and see and unify their data to create a better product. So it's exactly the sort of thing we need for ocean observation. And I'll stop there and be very happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Anya. I will turn the lights on over here and let's try something over here. Maybe you can see the audience in the room a little better. So do we have any questions in the room or online? All right, there's a question online from Hafiz, and if you don't mind turning your camera on, I think that makes it a little nicer to see people face to face.
Thanks for the presentation. I have like 3 questions to ask. My first question is this. You spoke a lot about removal of the carbon, but at the same time, there are still a lot of carbon that are going into the atmosphere. So if we are kind of working on removal, and I know that a lot of effort are also going into curbing the amount of carbon that is released into the atmosphere. But I think that if we are still adding tons to it, then it's like it will be a lot chaotic. And my second question is this: in terms of the nature of research and monitoring, I think it's a little bit skewed. Like the first I think on around slide 10 or something, you showed carbon sequestration. So when I was doing my MSc, there was like a lot of my colleagues that are trying to do that nature of research for their countries, looking Kelp and Aggie along the coast. But they face a lot of challenges in terms of data collection. And even during my own MSc also, I was trying to get high resolution bathymetry data for Cape Verde back then. I had to write to several companies and several research facilities if you can release this data that you've collected in Cape Verde. But most of them, I didn't get a good response from them. And even the one that sent the data, which leads me to my third question, the format that they sent to me was quite problematic to even kind of work on. So in terms of data archive also, it's a little bit challenging for researchers, especially for some people from some part of the world that they don't have this sophisticated technology and even the computing power to really work on those data. So are there like lot of effort looking at the situation in those kind of countries also in terms of bridging the gap of data collection, data archive, and releasing the data to the public? Thank you.
Yeah, no, both of those are really good questions. Like the first one, if I understand correctly, you're asking about, we also need to worry about emissions, not just mitigation. And I guess there's two answers to that. First of all, we don't have time to do one or the other. We have to do both, is often the answer given. And partly, if you look at the models, and particularly the recent IPCC report, they talk about if there's a bit of an overshoot, and it looks likely now that there will be an overshoot, then if we go above 1.5 degrees, getting back to it will require mitigation. So we don't just need net zero, we need net negative. And the only way to get there is through mitigation techniques. If suddenly tomorrow we started to accelerate our emissions reduction, then none of this would be necessary, or it could be less necessary. And I think you simply, we don't want to replace one with the other, because that's, emissions reduction are absolutely the foundation and the first thing to do. But we can see that we're not getting there. That's the concern. Your second issue about data access, particularly in developing nations, and the awkwardness of trying to reach those data, I couldn't agree more. And I don't have a simple answer for you, but I think it's a critical question. How do we get the data the people need to the people who need it? And that's part of the work that the Global Ocean Observing System does, is to consult well with nations both in all parts of the world, to make sure that their data needs are there. So maybe that's a conversation we need to sort of bring into the Global Ocean Observing System discussion.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question. So I think it's great to censor the ocean with everything we want to measure, but as a chemist, I'm thinking we don't have the sensors ready for everything we want to measure, and in particular for getting the CO2 system in the deep ocean. I don't think those sensors are quite as developed as they might need to be, considering the scale. So are you feeling like the private sector is ready to do this for us? If we say the governments are moving in this direction, they'll just get it done because they want those contracts, and that's possible?
Yeah, look, I mean, the quality of the sensors is critical. And so, when we're talking, for example, to the climate finance community, they are looking to buy carbon futures, right? Now, the critical thing here is those have to be blue chip carbon futures. And in order to have blue chip carbon futures, you need to have scientifically validated and credible sensors. So the private sector may finance the work, but without real researchers like yourself coming in there and saying, well, I mean, we just look at the problems with the Argos sensors recently, right? I mean, getting that right is super, super important. And if we don't get it right, then we're actually supporting an industry that's not credible and getting ourselves down the wrong road. So this is the absolute, place where that conversation is critical. And no industry partner will disagree with that. I mean, in fact, they're all hiring PhD chemists now to make sure that they have the right expertise on their teams. But they'll they're gonna depend on university research in the end.
Well, that's good news. All right, I think we have one from Xiaodong and then Jerry after him.
Hi, Anya. It was very nice talk, and I'm happy to hear somebody from Dalhousie University give us a presentation. I graduated from Dalhousie University, and actually, I like your idea. We need to observe ocean and much better than before. But I think for the purpose, if we just want to know how much carbon stored in the ocean, if we can observe atmosphere or land better, we should be able to tell how much end up in the ocean, right?
You mean by back calculating?
Yeah, I just, okay, there must be stuff there, because the observing ocean is difficult. It's pretty hard. And if we spend that much time, money, observe ocean, it might take 50 years, 60 years to reach there. Then what's the point? At that time, temperature already tipped.
Exactly. I mean, I think, to your point, I think what I'm hearing from climate modelers is that they're concerned about the increase of rare events and predicting those, and that they are struggling to get a handle on the probability of extreme events and the changing probability of extreme events. And so it's not the mean trajectory of any of these that's the worry. It's out on the wings of probability, where climate modelers are kind of signaling that they're struggling, and that's a data problem, right? But to me, it seems as if it's solvable potentially because we have many new data sources, which, if well focused, could solve these problems. The problem is they're solving they're solving commercial problems. We want them to solve the right ones, right? So I mean, we could go have a beer over this and have a much longer dive. That's a great question, and exactly where the critical uncertainties are is a big question, and then how to solve for those.
Okay, thank you.
Didn't answer your question, but anyway. Hi, Jerry.
Hey, Anya, I'm really, your opening remark about wished I could have been there in person, and I totally echo that. It would have been great here. So I'm not sure I have a question so much, but that graph you were showing about sort of the increase in sort of private sector data sets, but sort of in concert, there's this reduction, I guess, in sort of the more classical data sets, and that, I wonder, why is that happening?
Well, I think it's a funding issue, right? I think we look. You don't have to look much further than Canada. We used to have 10 ships, and now we have 1.5. I think ocean observation is expensive, and CTD casts are super expensive. They're the blue chip observation tool, but they cost a lot, and they cost a lot of people and ship time. And as also now as fuel's going up, you're kind of asking yourself, well, how sustainable are they? So, okay, that's not really answering your question either, but I'm not sure is the right answer. And but I can speculate as to why. It's just most of the stuff is funded by short-term funding sources. 80% of it is. And, we had JGOFs and WOS and some of the big programs in the day, right? Showing my age here. But now now we're talking about Argo floats and drones and satellites much more. And I don't think we've taken stock of the loss of deep CTD casts, like CTD casts that go down to 4,000, 6,000 meters, and how
Right.
many fewer of those we have. And that means we don't actually know as much about the heat store of the deep ocean and or anything else, right? So huge issue for us, I think.
Yeah, but I guess partly I'm wondering if, like the way you showed, there's this blossoming of private sector data, if that's sort of folding into the mindset of, oh, this is going to sort of supplant our normal operation. So we are comfortable with scaling back on some of the classical things, if that's part of the calculus, or is it just that's the way it's working, not necessarily that's planned?
I mean, I think that's what some people think the calculus is, but I guess I'm not sure that that's how it's going to work out, right? Because first
Right.
of all, some of those data are locked into commercial priorities, and second of all, we're not getting the carefully curated deep CTD casts that used to tell us what was really happening in the ocean.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point that you make about the sort of the loss of that true, the real quality control of the data sets. Is if that's really getting deteriorated, we're really hurting ourselves.
So,
And I,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just, if you want to respond to that, I was also going to sort of, I see we have another question, so we could keep that short and then let Kamal take a point.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, we have to convince industry that they can't get a good investment without beautiful QA/QC.
Right.
That they'll get the wrong number and that therefore their product will be inferior. That would be my, and they're open to that. Oh, but you're right. Let's go to Kamal's question.
Right.
Hey, Anya, great presentation. My question is actually a follow-up. So on the same chart, I saw a peak right around 2004, 5. And I was curious if it was because of the Indian Ocean tsunami, which affected hundreds of thousands of people and multiple countries, continents, and so on and so forth. It may not be that, but that's the first big event that came to my mind. So I mean, the climate change in essence affects multiple countries and billions of people. So what do you think, like the ISS example you gave, and maybe an understanding and a multinational comprehension of the urgency and efforts like you propose, do you think in some near future there will be some action?
Oh my goodness, Kamal, I sure hope so. I mean, I feel like I'm shouting myself hoarse on this issue. And slowly I feel like we're getting some traction, like the G7 discussions in the Future Seas and Oceans Initiative last week also focused in on ocean carbon and talked about how important that was. Global Ocean Observing System community supports a pilot in the North Atlantic. Like the pieces are coming together. What we really need is a nation to step up. And I talked to some of the senior officials in the US over the last couple of months, and they're kind of looking at their shoes and going, well, we've got really important internal stuff to think about, and it's not coming forward. So it's continue. Like I just have to stay gritty like those UN negotiators and not lose hope and keep pushing. Keep pushing. And I think, to your point about the Indian Ocean, I think it's death by 1,000 cuts. I think the Indian Ocean tsunami, COVID, a lot of moorings couldn't get there's a hole kicked in some of the observing systems during COVID because people simply couldn't get out in ships and do things. And then I think it's big observing nations like Canada getting bored with oceanography and saying, well, we have to do other things. Ships are too expensive. And it just sort of drifts down that way. And then industry starts showing sail drones that are doing amazing things, and everyone assumes the problem's solved anyway. But sail drones are like, they sample top 10 meters if you're lucky. And maybe now they're going to have winches that'll do the top 100 meters, but we need 6,000. So anyway, it's interesting because I get lots of agreement, but I action. Oh my goodness. That seems like too much work. We'll get there.
We will, hopefully.
Okay, last call for questions. And if not, let's thank Anya again. That was such a great presentation, and thanks for taking the time for this.
Really great to talk to you all, and really, really good to have this conversation. Hopefully, I can see some of you here in Halifax or come down and visit you one day too.
That would be great.
Good. Yeah, Anya.
See you, Jerry. See everybody.
Thank you.